Getting more and more focused as the day goes on. That's how we've structured the sessions. And so we're going to follow this up with our next speaker. Dr. Dwight Chapman is a chiropractor. He's a medical acupuncturist, and he's a clinic director for the High Point Wellness Center. Dr. Chapman runs a repetitive strain injury prevention program for the Globe and Mail. And he's also the team chiropractor for the Toronto Argonauts. Dr. Chapin and his team have also built and run corporate wellness programs for a variety of enterprises, including General Mills Canada, Bell Canada, Canada Post Corporation, and the Centre for Health and Safety Innovation, which is headquarters for Ontario's leading health and safety associations. So let's welcome Dr. Dwight Chapman.
Hello, everyone. Looks like I'm the final act before lunch. When I first spoke to Dr. Wells about today's workshop, he asked if I'd bring a case study forward from one of our corporate wellness programs. And we discussed doing so from the perspective of a clinician, someone who's on the front lines, someone who's dealing with MSDs on a daily basis. And that's where I live my life. When I'm not in the clinic or trying to keep the Argonauts on the playing field, I'm usually on site either treating or developing and helping to deliver programs focused on prevention. So the table has been set quite nicely, actually, for this case study. And I'll take you through what it is that we put together for Canada Post with an eye on MSD prevention and aging. We'll look at some of the common misconceptions that are out there. Most of these have been touched on already, so I'll work through that quickly, the case study, and then get into some of the recommendations that came out of the case study and the results as well. So here you're looking at an X-ray of a person had a fall and fell awkwardly while carrying a load. Hand got caught up underneath them like this. They fell forward. And you can see here and here, the person sustained two fairly nasty fractures. This injury took place in front of people. They witnessed the injury. The date of the accident is well understood. The time of the accident is well understood. The intervention is well understood. This person went right from the clinic to the hospital, right from the ER into ortho, where they were appropriately dealt with. Cast was put on, and as they came back to work, everyone understood what the situation was. There was a lot of chatter about the accident. There was a lot of understanding and compassion with respect to what that individual needed as they returned back to work, and accommodations were made for this individual. And with an injury like this, the cause and effect relationship is very well understood. And the system's geared towards dealing with these acute traumatic injuries quite well. But when you're looking at MSDs and you've got these repetitive stress injuries, these low threshold stress or cumulative stress disorders resulting in aches and pains, the waters get pretty muddy. People lose their way. First question I get when someone comes into the clinic and it's been this low stress cumulative injury is, "Doc, am I just getting older? What did you do? How did this injury come on? Describe to me what happened." "I didn't do anything." "Well, while you were doing nothing, what were you doing? Take me through your day. Take me through your week." Doing nothing for some is reshingling a roof on a weekend. Doing nothing for others is perhaps sitting and watching NFL football on Sunday. So the definition of doing nothing is always very interesting. But when we look at these types of injuries, they do raise a lot of interesting questions, not only for the person in pain, but also for the workplace. What injuries are injured? Is the injury work-related? How do we modify their work day? How do we appropriately treat this individual and get them back to work and back to their life quickly without a high risk of reoccurrence? And so we'll ask these patients that come in without much of an understanding necessarily of how their injury took place, or perhaps there's a misplaced understanding of where they think that injury started. They took the garbage out on Sunday night, and the garbage pail was put at the end of the driveway, and they walk back to the house, and boom, their back goes out. Well, that's the last time they want to take the garbage out. It was the garbage that caused the injury. Well, what's in behind the scenes and what set them up for that scenario? So we ask patients very quickly to label their pain on a pain scale from 0 to 10, 10 being the worst pain of their life, 0 being no pain. Where are you? Then you can have two individuals, same age, same job task, same diagnosis, same mechanism of injury, and one will grade their pain at a 2 out of 10, and one will grade their pain at a 12 out of 10. One's not right, one's not wrong, but the perception of their pain and the perception of their disability is quite different. And so what can organizations do given that perspective, and how can we shift and appropriately change our clinical approach to make sure that we're addressing both those scenarios correctly? So that leads to the common beliefs about aging and older workers, and this has already been covered quite nicely this morning. But this is what I face when I come into most workplaces, and these misconceptions are held by not only the individuals that are suffering from MSDs, but also in many cases in organizations. So chronological age determines health, and with age comes illness and disease. There's this acceptance of an inevitable decline in health with aging, and thankfully baby boomers are less tolerant to this. They're pushing the envelope with respect to what they're expecting from their bodies from an orthopedic perspective, and I love that trend. But older workers have less physical strength and endurance. Older workers take more time off sick. Older workers have difficulty adapting to change. Older workers find it hard to learn new information, making their knowledge and skills outdated. Older workers have more accidents in the workplace. Older workers are less productive. So we take this long list and we look at, well, MSDs are having a more pronounced effect on older workers than younger workers. That's the general sense, the general understanding or perspective that exists out there. And if we look at the Msd Guidelines for Ontario, and I'm preaching to the choir here today, we understand there's an obvious link between the physical load that's placed on the tissue and the risk of injury that accompanies MSDs from that perspective. But there are also a list of very important organizational factors which have also been touched on effectively this morning, and that's the employee's perception of their job stress and their degree of perception on their control of their job. It's whether or not their tasks are monotonous. It's the clarity of what's expected of them and the greater importance of what they do and how that fits into the model. And it's their job satisfaction. And there's some very interesting research being done through the Canadian Institute of Stress right now looking at the rate of aging and the risk of degenerative disease as it relates not to stress levels, but as it relates to the ratio between stress and satisfaction. And that ratio is a better predictor of the rate of aging. And finally, low social support. So Canada Post decided to get out ahead of this curve. Like any other Ontario workplace, they were experiencing high numbers of MSD injuries and the costs associated with those. In 2006, I had done a national lecture tour with Canada Post call centers talking about stress resiliency and ergonomics. In 2008, we went back and did it again, this time talking about healthy activity and healthy nutrition as a way to stay healthy in the workplace. And that was to their call centers. So because of that knowledge I had of Canada Post, they asked if I would help them with this initial program. This was what they were looking at. So 50% of their disabling injuries fell under a category that they described as overexertion or their manual material handling injuries. It was really a grab bag of injuries. They didn't really fully at this point understand how aging fit in here or what types of injuries they were looking at. So they needed to get inside that number, and they attempted to do so with this program. They put together a very intelligent, sophisticated group of ergonomists and health and safety specialists that came together to study these numbers, developed programs to support the workers. Ergo lifts were designed to help reduce the physical load as they were moving materials through the plants. Every new piece of equipment went through a very lengthy process of review, and they had all their employees go through safe lift training. So that happened before I got to the stage. And what they then decided to do was identify their top risks. And they were identified as, well, there were injuries taking place in the plant where people were lifting. So at Canada Post, you walk through the plant, and it's unbelievable what people will put a stamp on and mail, from small parcels to canoes to tires to you name it. So these folks are dealing with everything under the sun. And most of the small parcels and letter mail are moved in bins, big Tupperware containers, some larger than others, called polytainers or lettertainers. And those containers are moved in bins to larger bins. And so there's a lot of potential injury that takes place through a day, through a shift. So moving with a load, a lot of these loads or lettertainers or containers of small parcels are moved in what's called baker's racks. So you have people pulling and pushing heavy equipment and forklifts moving in every which direction. A lot of upper extremity repetitive strain injuries, moving heavy bags of mail, and also the letter carriers and the sorting that takes place. Letter sorters will step back in these large cabinets and step back from the cabinet, and they're facing a certain postal code. And they'll stand and they'll sort to the postal code. And some are standing back so they can get a full perspective of the postal code. And so there's a lot of bending and twisting. Their legs are planted in one place. And it's a lot of rotational injuries. Some of these cabinets are designed specifically for shorter employees or taller employees, but every once in a while you get someone in the wrong case and they end up reaching up all day long, placing them at high risk as well. Postural strain took place with a lot of the data entry that takes place in some of the automated conveyors. So they took these 5 issues. All the employees had gone through the safe lift training, and they took these issues and they developed an off-site program. They were going to bring all their managers and supervisors in and take them through a training specific to these high-risk areas that had been identified by their team of ergonomists. And so we did so. Huge support from senior management. We ran a wonderful program where there was equipment that was brought on site and demonstrations that were done, and we had each of the active managers and supervisors go through the program and demonstrate their understanding of not only the risk but how best to reduce the risk. And the program was developed around the observation of the risk, how to lead a safety talk with your employees when you come back to the plant, what the inspection tools were as they were monitoring best practices, a sophisticated audit tool to understand just exactly how well their employees were following the lifts, and then this final safe lift training that was done. So this one day sort of represented the end of a very long campaign, and there was a real feeling of satisfaction, a real feeling of we really nailed it, this was it. My role on this day was to speak about spinal mechanics and safe lifting as it relates to loads on the spine. And so we came out of this day and we all expected the numbers to show that we had done a good job. And of course, much to our disappointment, they did not. The numbers showed that, the concerns were not specifically addressed. They did not relate well to the workstation, and the managers and supervisors did not feel comfortable taking this messaging forward. So we had fallen short in what the objective was. You could line up 10 Canada Post employees and ask them to demonstrate a safe lift, and they would do so perfectly, 10 times out of 10. But when they were on site, the game changed. And not only did the game change, but the game changed in that there was this background of this issue or concern with respect to aging, an issue with respect to the confidence that the managers and supervisors had to come up, speak out, and call people out or coach people on best practices. And so they were stuck. So I was asked to come back and work with this team, and how can we address these issues, and what is our next step going to be? And we came back to this classic balanced equation of applied force versus the tissue capacity or tissue tolerance. And the better part of the campaign, particularly that one day, the off-site day, was spent on the load. It was spent on what the forces are with these specific tasks in these high-risk areas. And there wasn't much discussion on tissue capacity or tissue tolerance as it related to the individual. And so my recommendation was that that's where we needed to go. We needed to take this program and we needed to get on the floor and we needed to roll up our sleeves and really start working with these folks and get their buy-in and trust. So that's what happened. For the first time that anyone could remember around the table, they let me walk free on the floor without health and safety. And as the third party, I got the advantage of getting some trust out of the gates with these people and started to work on breaking down some of these barriers. And so it was just one conversation at a time, working with small groups of managers and supervisors and asking them a ton of questions, doing a lot of listening. Show me where you're having trouble. Where are your employees having difficulties? What's going well? Where are you getting bogged down? And across the board, across the plant, and these were 3 long weeks. I was there at all hours, all shifts, working with everybody. Across the board, the number one issue or concern from the floor was that productivity and efficiency trumped health and safety. And a lot of this campaign was really window dressing, and there wasn't a real genuine commitment behind what was being preached. And so we just tackled that head on, and the fact that I was there speaking to the nighttime manager at 2 in the morning demonstrated a certain level of commitment to getting this right, and understanding that if we got this right, that the productivity and efficiency would follow suit. And so slowly we shifted the conversation to their individual capacity and their individual tissue tolerance and what could they bring to the game on any given day to keep them in that sweet spot, to keep them in that area where they have the highest capacity and the lowest risk of injury. And as I worked my way through each of these groups, this is what I was looking for. So I had my eye open for workers that had made their own modifications. In some cases they were better than what was being suggested. In other cases it was putting them at higher risk. Looking for people that were using splints or supports or braces, or people that were grabbing their muscles or shaking out their back or their shoulders. And I'd just go up to them and say, hey, talk to me about your shoulder. What's going on over there? Or I like the way you did that. And then call someone else over. See the way this individual is doing this. And many times that example is me bringing a younger employee to an older employee who's got it figured out because they have had injuries and they have a better sense of how to do the job and avoid injury. And those small conversations broke down some of the angst that was there and started conversations where people started to feel comfortable coaching one another. So looking and talking to people again, reporting pain, discomfort, fatigue, and certain tasks that were creating other issues with them, and so apprehension related to that. So as we worked through the floor, again, where we saw a lot of behavior or movement patterns that were best practices, we'd call them out. And we would celebrate that that's a job well done, and we'd bring other people in, as I've said, and looked at the way in which things were being done. So the picture on the bottom left there, someone sorting larger mail into one of the lettertainer containers and in neutral posture, and she's grabbing the mail with both hands, so it's not a wide grip grasp, which creates forearm, elbow, wrist troubles, and she's not pivoting and rotating in a way that puts her back at that lower risk. So we just, one by one, went through and found examples of people demonstrating best practices. Here you have someone reaching out across a counter. That workstation is designed for her to be working on the other side, so she theoretically should be standing here, just in front of the workstation on the other side of that conveyor belt. But just because of efficiencies and pace of her day, she found it easier to sometimes reach out and across, and there was no surprise that she had a rotator cuff problem. Here's an individual pulling the lettertainers out of the deep, what's called monotainer or larger container to hold the mail. The ergonomic lifts designed to bring this workstation up into that sweet zone so they're not at high risk of injury and avoid the bending and lifting and twisting. And in the picture to the right, you can actually see there is an ergo lift right there, but not being used. And individual continues to bend and twist in awkwardly. So he's had the training, understands the appropriate approach, but needed that individual coaching on site. And so station by station, we started to break down where there was risk of injury. Older workers seem to have a tendency to lift with their legs. They seem to respect their back more so than the younger workers, and seem to have a difference in their strength of their leg muscles, leg extensors versus back extensors. And so we were able to call that out and again celebrate that lifting practice. Here's an individual who's emptying a mail bag, and these bags are heavy. And so some folks prefer to hold them way up like this and dump the contents out as they start to be sorted down the conveyor belt. Others lay the bag down on the conveyor and feed the mail out, which of course comes at a much lower risk. So the conversation goes to, what is your capacity on any given day. This is the job you're doing. Sure, there's a higher risk with it. Okay, you've got this problem and that problem. What else can you be doing to set yourself up for success? Issues of aging and muscle endurance and fatigue were also seen with repetitive tasks, particularly with shoulders. And there was a difference that we saw in the study with isometric work capacity that did exist between older and younger individuals, particularly in those stations where there was overhead lifting. So on day one and through the training, there was a lot of this discussion of these tissue fatigue curves, and we've seen some of these this morning. And in the off-site, the importance of these curves was missed. The people didn't understand how it related to their job. So the force goes up, the repetitions go up, then your risk of injury goes up. You're in that high stress area. You've gone beyond what your capacity is. But if we can keep you in that either lower force or lower repetition, or we can move you in and out of job tasks that bring you back into that green, safe zone, then obviously the risk of injury drops, and the person is safer through their shift, through their career. And where we really started to get them to understand that graph was with this basic model, and that's that your general state of health, your base operating level, is defined by 4 factors. Right? We talk about your health as being defined by your age, by your nutritional health, by your physical fitness, and by your genetics. And people like to put a lot of stock in that first category, the age category. Well, there's not a whole lot we can do about that. But if you look at those 4 factors, there's 2 things that we can have great control over. And in looking at nutritional practices and how you're fueling your body for success and looking at your general level of physical fitness, despite age, we can increase capacity. And if we do so, then the resources you have on any given day, despite the risk you're exposed to, can lead to this ability to increase your optimal level of performance. So the difference between the baseline and the optimal level of performance is this capacity that's been talked about this morning. But that capacity is variable for all of us, despite age. And so we have to get strategic, one-on-one, with each of these individuals and general themes and strategies to help them move forward and even increase that optimal level of performance, increase their capacity. At the end of all of these walkthroughs and discussions with folks, at the end of the day, the list of the 5 top injury risks were exactly the same as they were at the very beginning of the campaign. That really hadn't shifted. What had shifted was the trust. What had shifted was the conversations that were happening. What had shifted was that individuals were now comfortable helping each other and watching each other, supporting one another with the best practices. So age has been shown, as it's been demonstrated this morning, not to be an independent risk factor for work-related MSDs. As we age, we're not able necessarily to perform the same level as we were when we were young. Older workers are more susceptible to work-related MSDs than younger workers, but that's largely due to a decreasing functional capacity. The risk of injury is related more to the difference between the demands of work and the worker's physical work capacity or the workability rather than it is age. And that's great news from where we're coming from, because when we can get someone excited about what they can do, we get someone to take a critical look at their day-to-day practices and understand how they can influence those, how they can make changes, gives them the control back. It really shifts the conversation with respect to MSD prevention. So we're looking at 3 main changes with aging clinically. There's a reduction in joint mobility, there's a decreased muscular strength, there's a slowing reaction in movement times. And so it goes beyond the scope of today's discussion, but in these small workshops we discussed each of these and got down into the individual level. Changes in physical abilities with aging are influenced by individuals' genetics as well as the lifestyle practices in the environment in which they're living and working. Older workers can often compensate for losses of work related to functional capacity with strategies and skills gained through experience. And so giving the older workers that voice and the confidence and the platform with which to share their successes had a big impact on the findings. So at the end, we found that health is influenced obviously by a number of factors other than aging, breaking down that misconception. We really got into the lifestyle issues and practices and blurred the lines between what they're doing at work and what they're doing at home, and what kind of shape do you want to be in at the end of the shift, at the end of the career, and giving them the tools with which to make those changes. Older workers did not show to be taking more time off, always taking more time off than younger workers, and older workers do not always have more accidents in the workplace than the younger workers. So we got inside that 50% number of overexertion injuries and started to understand the data. So at the end of the day, we had very positive feedback from the supervisors, overwhelming request for additional sessions, and this pilot went then from Ottawa to the London Windsor plant. And at this particular plant, inside 6 months, we saw an 18% reduction in their manual material handling injuries. So the recommendations coming out of the study was, okay, we understand the physical load and stresses on tissue. There needs to be an emphasis on the floor with respect to tissue capacity, tissue tolerance. That's going to be different for everybody. It's not necessarily age dependent, and that's a good story. So what can individuals do in their day-to-day lifestyle practices to look at their nutritional health, to look at their physical fitness, their prior history, and make appropriate accommodations to set them up for success? And if you do so, you will result in fewer injuries. And that is it.
Great. We have time for a number of questions here before we start lunch. Yeah, that was phrased poorly.
Hi, Matthew Lamb from West Park Healthcare Center. I was just wondering, how did you approach the topic of general fitness and nutrition with the workers? Just because I think that sort of when you go into a workplace and talk about things that workers would like to do or should do outside the workplace, they tend to get a little
Right. Absolutely. So the question is, how do we start the conversation about nutrition and lifestyle practices without upsetting folks or getting in their business? And I have a distinct advantage being an outsider coming in as a healthcare practitioner. Kind of gives me a license to just be blunt and ask the question. And once the conversation was out there, there was a general understanding that, whether or not I'm properly hydrated, whether or not I'm eating the right foods to support my physical health, there was an understanding, and so that created the conversation. So the barrier was reduced because of that, and that's how that worked.
Good morning.
Hello.
My name is Candace Ballinger-Michaud, and I'm actually with Workplace Safety North. I work with Elizabeth Mills.
Hello.
So I've heard about your corporate wellness program. And I guess I'm following up on the same comment with regard to the investment that a company or workplace needs to make, both tangibly and intangibly, to support a corporate wellness program and the direct benefits that it will have on the workplace with regard to the subject matter you had this morning.
Right. So when we're developing programs and we're working with the companies that I get a lot of questions about, how did you get in there? What's your program? How was it designed? And each of the programs that we run are very unique. The program that we run for the Globe and Mail, for example, is largely based on office ergonomics. The program that we run, we put a clinical team on place twice a week and convert a boardroom to a treatment facility. And all of the coaching, all of the workstation evaluations, all of the treatment that's provided and done on site is largely done with an emphasis on prevention and getting out in front of that curve. And so when you're looking at developing a program, there's studies that show that if it's done well and the clinicians have a good sense of culture and they're breaking down some of the barriers that exist in access to care, the time it takes to get the care that's required, and the clinical team has a good sense of the stresses that are related to the workplace, then those programs have been shown to show an ROI anywhere from 3 to 1 to 8 to 1. So a lot of these programs, they more than fund themselves, and businesses are now looking at them as a strategic best practice, not as a nice to have. And that's a real tipping point with respect to corporate wellness. So we will come on site and there'll be surveys that will be done to get an understanding of what are the health risks. Sometimes there's a health risk assessment that's also done that gives us a lot more information to then design a program that's appropriate. And then we just go after those metrics. Does that answer your question? Yes?
Wherever I go, people are running away from me.
Morning. Mary Kay Sarovich, Manager People Services, City of Toronto, Long-Term Care Homes and Services. I was wondering, in any of your clients, have you ever run across an environment where moving humans, dynamic as opposed to static material handling, the employees, you train, you have extensive MSDs, you've got health and safety, but the employees believe because, or may believe, because you are dealing with individuals who may be resistive to care or unable to move themselves, and live, unpredictable individuals, that none of this makes sense. If you're going to get your job done, you might get hurt anyway, and they've been doing it that way for 25 years. Now, who are you to come in and tell me I know what I'm doing?
Yeah, that was my favorite, and I got to a point where working with Canada Post in this particular case study, I would seek those individuals out, and you can see it in their eyes. You can just tell that they're looking at you thinking, what do you know? Like, put 25 years into this plant and then come talk to me about your tissue capacity. And it's not easy. I start with a conversation around it being about them and what they can do through their choices to set themselves up for success. And whether or not they choose to accept that is up to them. And I place a lot of value on the years and the experience that they have. I spent a lot of time listening to what worked for them and trying to understand why that worked for them. Were they hiding an injury? Was it easier to modify this task, doing it this way versus that way because they felt like it saved a troubled shoulder, or was it just patterns of years of doing it that way? So where I saw a good reason for it, we would discuss why that makes sense, and this is likely happening or helping you in this way because, so they had an understanding of why that was a good decision. And then I had a little bit of wiggle room to come over here. Now when you do this is the higher risk. So we needed to have these types of discussions and go through some of this research and data and understanding of stress curves and risks and proper lifting and so forth. But in this example, we demonstrated that's not enough. You had to bring it to the person. And I have worked with assisted living facilities and dementia care facilities, and it's a very different discussion when you're moving a person instead of a parcel. And the risk profile and the uncertainty is just that much greater, so they need to even be better. And so it's putting back on them what it's going to take to be a professional and do so appropriately and do so with a lower risk of injury in that chosen field. So I don't have an easy answer for you other than I found that I've had success by gaining the trust, and once I had the trust, then it opened a conversation to them being willing to listen at least.
Rick Sansom, Machinists and Aerospace Workers Union. I'm curious, in your presentation, you spoke about the interaction that you had with the workers, about their physical way that they handle themselves in the workplace. But a lot of the photographs that you showed the actual physical makeup of the workplace, the racks you talked about where they were sorting, the ability for the parts to raise up to the workers, the keyboard that was too far away. What kind of changes were made at Canada Post to the actual physical workplace? And I see that you're focusing on the workers themselves, but what about the mechanics of the workplace?
That's an excellent question. Understand that my role was very much in the human mechanics and the biomechanics, and the parts that I was to work with were the human body and the biomechanics as it related to fitting the work to the worker. So the team of ergonomists, as I said at the beginning, go through a very extensive process of reviewing all equipment that's brought in to allow for best practices and keep people lifting in a safe zone. And so they have an extensive internal process of which I'm not a part of, where they review equipment and workstation design before it's brought into practice. And that's done through extensive testing, and then they set up beta testing where they take the equipment through a simulation before determining whether or not it's going to move forward into what they're calling postal transformation. So I got close enough to the culture to see that that was being done. My job was to take what was there and help people better accommodate to what was there.
Amal Messick at Unifor, you said in your study that you found at the beginning that talking to the workers that productivity trumped all else, and that ergonomics was typically not in the forefront, and that this study was just a window dressing. Was there any subsequent studies that talked about maybe changes in attitudes to what people had to ergonomics versus productivity, or both of them, from a managerial side and from a worker side?
That's a fabulous question, and I'd love to say yes. To my knowledge, no. There wasn't, but this program would have fallen flat if we couldn't win that fight. So there's, to the point that was made earlier, research and more work to be done there. That trust in that one point, that issue of this conversation is the beginning of getting us on the right path to a workplace that's truly safe and puts you in a good position, understanding there's risks associated with this type of work, understanding that you're taking that risk on. So what are you doing when you come to work to reduce that risk? And if we couldn't have that conversation with some meaning, then it wouldn't have gone anywhere. So that's definitely an area that, in my opinion, needs greater attention. Thank you.
Okay, let's leave it there for now. We'll have more opportunities during the session this afternoon to ask questions. So let's again thank Dr. Chapman for his presentation.